So the challenges of like having to actually talk about it.
Yeah, I totally blanked for a second there. I'm gonna grab a caramel and sugar fuel my brain a little bit.
All right.
Yeah. No.
I'm Steve Gaynor, and this is Tone Control, Conversations with Video Game Developers. Today, I'm lucky enough to be in San Francisco talking to Jonathan Blow.
That is indeed the case.
Confirmed.
Yes.
They're both in this room
Exclusive.
at the same time. Man, just hot scoops from square one. I'm at John's office where he and his team are working on The Witness. And of course, John worked on, was the creator of Braid before that, that came out to wild acclaim in 2008?
2008, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I'm thanks for chatting with me on this thing.
Thanks for coming by.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about your games, what you've released, what you're working on now, but also something that I think, maybe this is just my perception, but I feel like for a lot of people, like what you were up to before you became the face of Braid is quite obscure or unknown, because you are, I don't know what, in your 40s?
Yes.
Yeah.
I just turned 42.
Okay, yeah.
So
you made Braid when you were, some years into your career. It wasn't like you were, straight out of college or something, but also you just sort of, at least I think from my perception, you just kind of like appeared, So how did you get started in being involved with making video games in the first place?
Well, it depends on if you count as a hobbyist or professionally.
Well, you're a programmer by trade originally, right? Yeah. So did you get a CS degree traditionally, or? I
was in school for CS, major in computer science, minor in English creative writing, and I dropped out before I finished either of those.
Okay.
I was almost done with CS. I could have finished in one more semester, but I just couldn't handle school anymore.
Where did you go to school?
There, Berkeley.
Oh, okay.
University of California, Berkeley.
Are you from the Bay Area originally?
I'm from Southern California.
Okay.
Yeah, but
you've been here for a while.
You get when from wherever in California you are, right? Like all the schools, the state schools give you cheap tuition,
right?
Which back then actually was affordable. Like now, colleges are crazy expensive.
Even if you're in state for a UC school.
Yeah, I don't know how people do it now. I guess they all get loans, right? That's the thing.
So what did you drop out for? Was it you just didn't want to be in school anymore, or was it you went to do something?
I was really depressed about being in school. I didn't like it.
No, sure.
I didn't have a good time. And we can touch on this later, but it's actually not that different from certain working situations I would get myself into. I seem to have a personality where part of me wants to be doing the thing that seems like the absolute most important thing for me to be doing. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm certainly not happy, right? And can get depressed and whatever. And so college was sort of like a holding pattern, sort of. I was going there. It was good that I went there, especially in the beginning, because I'd done... I'll backtrack in a little bit and fill this in, but in high school and before that, I'd learned programming, and I could program better than any of my friends and stuff. I could do stuff in BASIC and assembly language, but there's a difference between that and knowing computer science, right?
Sure.
And
I'll take your word for it. Being a non-technical person, it sounds like a true statement.
But over the first two and a half years I was at Berkeley, I learned what the spirit of computer science is. Which is a really good thing to know. And you can probably learn that yourself. You don't have to go to school, especially now that there's the internet.
Right.
But it's actually kind of hard to learn that yourself.
When you think of that concept, what is that dividing line? It doesn't. You don't have to give me a dissertation on it, but is it more like the philosophy of how you interact with the computer through code?
Well, I can mention one or two things but it's actually really involved. It's kind of subtle, actually. But okay, so at the most basic level, what makes computer science a science, right?
Yeah.
Is that it actually is about certain properties of the universe, apparently, right? So if you want to think about how hard is it to compute something, right? Like, if I want to know, I don't know. Like, if I want to search for something, and these are the properties of the kind of things I'm searching for, and here's how many there are. There's bounds on how long that takes, given how many resources you spend and things like that, right? And there's a whole very specific discipline about knowing all the bounds on all these algorithms, right? And about how expensive they are. That I actually was never that motivated to get that far into, but that's sort of really the sciencey part.
Yeah.
Okay. But actually most of what gets called computer science is really engineering, which is fine too, and I'm not knocking that. I actually lean more toward the engineering side, actually.
Is it the case that what would be termed engineering is the more practical skill side of the knowledge of what you do with programming, or would that not be?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. But also, like, practical at a deeper level, right? So when I was in high school and grade school before that, I could write a program. I could sort of write an assembly language and like make some stuff happen, but the computer itself was kind of a black box, right? And like, you go to school and you get serious about it, and you're like, okay, I understand what's happening between memory and the processor and the bus and the disk, and like, I declare some variables in C, and I see in my head how they're laid out in memory, and I see when I do this instruction to fetch this value, like what that's going to touch, right?
Yeah. And
once you understand that stuff, you just become a much better programmer,
Yeah. No, I imagine. So I think that's true with so many disciplines, where it's like, yeah, you can see deep enough just to make something happen in a almost like superstitious or naive way. It's like the pieces, but then the structure of the thing underlying it can give you much more insight into what else you might be able to do. Yeah,
and then the other thing you get from school is a broad exposure. At least at Berkeley, you got a broad exposure to different languages. So you would show up at the school, and the first language you would learn is a programming language called Scheme, which is based on Lisp. Okay. And the course that was being taught at Berkeley was basically a duplicate of one that was being taught at MIT, and sort of nobody else did it this way. But a lot of schools think of themselves as they're teaching you a trade skill when you show up. So and in fact that faction of thought sort of won over even at Berkeley, and they don't teach Scheme anymore. But it'll be like, oh, let's teach you as your introductory language, like something like Java or something that's going to get used out in the real world.
Right.
And this is the opposite of that. This was like, we're going to teach you a language that you probably won't use in a job, but that is really good at illustrating basic concepts and it being simple, right? And also and also that, because you're going to learn these other languages later, by the time you learn 2 or 3 of these, you've seen a broad spectrum of things, right?
Yeah.
Some things really sucked about Scheme, like debugging it was terrible, but debugging everything was terrible in like the late 80s, early 90s.
I get the impression it's still not always the best part of a programmer's job.
It's not always the best, but it's so much better now. It's not funny.
So you were learning all that stuff, but like, school wasn't the place for you.
I didn't love it.
So then did you go into like software development stuff?
Yeah, there's always, at any school like that has a relatively well-regarded computer science program, there's always people like leaving, like starting stuff. So I kind of got involved with a business-related software company for less than a year. I didn't like it. It was a really flaky company. Like, the guy who ran it was... It became clear that I wanted to get out of there.
Sure.
So shortly after that, I bailed and I went I was a contractor at Silicon Graphics, which was once a well-regarded software company and hardware company.
Yeah,
right?
They made workstations, Silicon Graphics workstations.
Yeah, indeed. And those were the shiny workstations that everyone wanted to use when I was in college, right?
Yeah.
So I went there, and they were doing a project that involved, trying to do a set-top box for Japan, and they were working with Time Warner on that, and they wanted some game stuff on there, and they needed someone to port Doom and Doom 2 to this set-top box, So I did that.
Yeah, and that was a tidbit that I know I had heard. You might have mentioned it in one of your GDC talks or something. That sounds like that's hilarious. That must have been like a really interesting experience, but that's also such an esoteric platform and
it was interesting, but it also you can look at that and think it's good experience, but I also feel like it was kind of a waste of time.
It's at least kind of a good story.
It's a good story. I mean, I got
that.
No, I mean, one day, sort of one anecdote from this is, one day I was just kind of starting to get the port together, and it had been, because I'd never done anything on this scale before, and I'd been working on it for a little while. I don't even remember how long, but at least weeks, right?
Yeah.
And I sort of had something where, there was, no sound yet, and it had it running in a window, and it was just really, you could, the graphics were rendering in the wrong format and stuff, but if you really squinted, you could sort of tell that something like Doom was actually running, right? And it just was displaying really poorly and all that. And I had no experience. I didn't do any graphic stuff in college or anything, so I did more general stuff. So that was the first time I'd done something like that. And then, all these upper level people were walking around the people from Japan are visiting on Monday. What can we show them? And one of them came up and said, how far are you along on this? And I was I showed him this. And he's like, oh, we can't show them that, right? So I came to work both days over the weekend and had it running perfectly on Monday. And they showed it, and to some Japanese guy, it was like, oh, it looks like a video game.
Right. But, I mean, I imagine, at least for the people you were working with, that was a clear demonstration of character. You had the pride in actually wanting to be able to show the thing, right?
Trying to play Doom on a TV remote is terrible. But I had it working.
And I've done it on airplanes. They'll have Doom with some faux Super Nintendo controller that comes out of the arm thing.
I just don't even ever turn those on because they're always so terrible.
I tried it once just to be how the hell terrible is this going to be? And it was unplayable, and then I stopped.
I mean, now that portable devices exist, there's basically no reason for those.
I assume that they are being completely phased out.
Yeah. Anyway, so that was... So the reason I say that was kind of a waste of time is it... any kind of large company like that... there's a lot of things that usually happen, right? First of all, it's generally an inefficient structure. If you're in a large company and you're young and you're trying to learn, you're how fast you can learn is sort of limited by the environment you're in, right?
Yeah.
Whereas right after this, I ended up starting a game company with a friend of mine from college. And it was just us at the beginning, and then we brought someone in, a third person, to do art stuff.
And that was in the mid-90s?
1996.
Okay.
And in that kind of environment, you're only limited by yourself. So if you're a motivated person, you can do things very quickly, and you can learn very quickly, and you can basically just crank, right?
Yeah.
So that was much more valuable, actually, than all the, than either of the previous two jobs there.
Sure. So what was it like starting a small game company in the mid-90s?
It was the worst possible time to start a game company.
It doesn't... I mean, that was also, I guess, somewhere around when, Valve started or something, but you guys weren't starting with, millions of dollars. You were starting with two dudes in an apartment, right?
Yeah, and I think Valve started...
94, 95?
A little before us,
sure,
right? But they were also starting at a relatively hard time, so let's not knock that. But they had more resources, right? So the thing that made it the hardest possible time is that games had started to become 3D, right? So Quake was out, right?
Yeah.
Quake was in beta release when we started, and it released like in summer '96, if I remember correctly. Right. So everyone was trying to do Quake-like things, and there's a big difference between putting sprites on a screen in 2D and like 3D rendering at, back then, a good frame rate was like 20 frames per second or more on a 486, 66 megahertz.
Yeah.
You didn't have graphics cards, so you had to learn all these algorithms about like, how do I rasterize a triangle? How do I do that like pixel accurately so that the textures don't drift and stuff? And it's just a tremendous learning curve.
And you guys were trying to do 3D stuff.
Yeah, we did. We totally did. Our game was not that accessible. We used every key on the keyboard twice. So it was kind of
I guess that's one definition of not that accessible.
Yeah. No, I mean, by modern standards, it's completely unplayable. Yeah. But back then...
Was it released? Can people play this thing? Can you find evidence
I don't
on the
think
internet?
you can play it anymore. So for a while, the first couple of releases, there was a company called Total Entertainment Network, right? Which actually...
10.
We worked with, like, our project managers at 10, the publisher for our first thing, ended up being the founders of PopCap later on and making bazillions of dollars.
Because 10 wasn't 10 like it was almost like a web portal-ish thing. It was like GameSpy sort of.
Yeah, so before everyone had like real internet, right? You would have dial-up modems and you would call stuff, and a lot of dial-up modems are slow. So there were a couple of companies, 10 was one of them, where they had the idea like, oh, you subscribe to our service and we give you extra fast connectivity somehow. I don't know how, but and then you can play action games and you pay like a monthly subscription fee, like for HBO or something.
Right. Yeah.
That was the idea, and it only after even a couple of years, it became clear that was not really going to be a business model that existed, and so they went out of business or something.
So was the game that you made like only available through their service?
It was at first, and then when they shut down, we brought it to another. So there was this company called Interactive Magic that used to do like flight sims and stuff, and then they had their own portal, and so we brought it there with some modifications. And then eventually, after a while, when we shut the company down, my old business partner, a guy named Bernie, just ran it for free on the web for a while.
Well, I mean, I'm intrigued. What is this? What is the name of the game?
It went through several names. We had multiple versions and stuff, but I think the last one that you could have played for free on the internet was called Wolfram 2.
Okay. That almost sounds weirdly familiar. I may have actually something's in my memory back.
It's a 3D. It's a team-on-team, multiplayer only. As if 3D game wasn't hard enough.
You also pulled...
Because I really liked the game like NetTrek back in college, which was a team-on-team. You could think of it as like Star Trek football or something, right? Where you're flying spaceships around. It was a brilliant multiplayer game for friends.
Star Trek football is good.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it was. Yeah. I don't know how it holds up now because I haven't played it in a long time, but we wanted to do something a little like that. So it was a team-on-team thing where you come in the world and you're driving a tank around and, you're building bases and stuff and you're trying to kill all the enemy bases, right? It was that kind of thing. But then you also had like an uplink where, one person could be the commander and control spaceships. And the spaceships, you wanted to put them kind of forward so they could drop your cargo forward and stuff. But then you had to defend it. It was easier to defend if it was in your backfield. Yeah. But then there was a spaceship metagame where the space overhead was like a grid, right? And so your commander was sort of playing a game with the enemy commander about, okay, if I get two spaceships adjacent to one spaceship, then we're firing on it and it'll die after a few minutes if you don't save it. Yeah. And so the guys on the ground can for the spaceships to move, you have to be powering the square from the ground to clear the field. Yeah. Right. So it's actually a very intricate game that had a lot of interesting things about it.
Yeah. No, it sounds like crazy, like multiple levels. Was it?
But it was too complicated to understand.
Were there enough players that separate people were controlling stuff on the ground and in space, or was the same person splitting attention between the ground game and the space game?
So if the game was full, it was 32 players probably, 16 on a team, which by the way was not easy over 9600 baud modems. We worked hard to make that happen.
Yeah. It sounds a little bit like the 3D remake of Battlezone that came out in the...
Yeah, I mean, that was a bit later.
Yeah.
And I don't think that had multiplayer, did it? It had one-on-one or something.
Yeah, I don't remember, but... Anyway, it sounds like...
Anyway, it was a super... Game. Like, any one of those things that I mentioned was technically challenging.
Yeah.
And we did all of them. So that was a really good learning experience. We went broke, and I was burned out for several years after that from working hard. But that's how I became a good programmer, really.
Awesome. I mean, that does sound like a trial by fire, I guess.
It was a hard time. There were some other game companies with smart people in them that were even doing less ambitious stuff like that and still didn't succeed. Yeah. So
I think that
the game NetStorm that came out around that same time with Zach Simpson and Art Min and all these guys, really smart guys, worked on that game, and it just it was again mainly multiplayer, and it was a little too early to really do something that was mainly multiplayer.
Yeah, I think that Harvey Smith had a similar story where before working on Deus Ex, he was the lead on a game called Fireteam, which was like a 4v4 multiplayer only thing in the mid '90s, and it was just there wasn't enough infrastructure, right? There weren't enough players to support it. The design language wasn't far enough,
It's how do you give people people didn't pay money for things on the internet in 1996. That just wasn't a thing.
Yeah, well, I remember being on the internet in the late 90s and being you put your credit card in? It was a bold new fucking world.
Even toward the first .com crash, which is ultimately what killed our first company, because we started doing this thing where it's hey, there's all these tech companies springing up and they all need websites, so we'll have some people doing websites, and we'll use that revenue to fund longer-term game development. Yeah. And then when all those companies went out of business, we had to shut down because our whole business model was yanked from
us. No longer had customers on the
website. Yeah.
Well, so just to, this may be the most straightforward answer in the world, but you came from CS background and you did some work in business stuff and whatnot, but obviously you did a lot of work and put yourself probably in more difficult situations to do game dev stuff, even from the very beginning when you were leaving college. So are you what would you say your motivation was early? Was it just like so many game developers, you're just so psyched about games, you just want to make games because games are cool, or was it more because I know that also, having talked to programmers, especially in AAA, it's the reason you have a job making a game when you could be getting paid twice as much to program a database is just because interesting real-time 3D graphics programming problems and AI and stuff that you don't get to do elsewhere. So what drew you into making games?
It was the first one, really, because we didn't know how hard games were, right, when we started. And nobody did. They were just starting to get hard. So, that year, either 96 or 97, it's probably 97, but one of those 2 years, Mike Abrash was at the Game Developers Conference and giving sort of now that they had figured out everything behind Quake, giving a rundown of it, and he was so if you want to do something like this, a competitive project on this scale, I'd say about a year and a half is the minimum schedule, right? And a wave of shock went through the audience. Everyone couldn't believe that they were supposed to work on a game for a year and a half, right? Which sounds like a joke today, right? But it was serious. It was people were "Is he serious? 18 months?"
Well, I think it probably would have been similar to at that time, or even fucking 5-10 years later than that. Being to make a game that's competitive, you're probably going to need a team of 200, 300 people. That's just standard now if you're making GTA or Assassin's Creed or something. But then it's what would all those people be doing?
Dude, there was a time, speaking of Game Developers Conference, there was a time when someone from EA was showing up. I forget, was it around Battle for Middle-earth time? I don't remember. I might be getting my games confused, but it was in conjunction with one of these games. And the guy gave this speech, and the whole gist of the speech was, look, you need 100 people to make one of these games now, and EA is the only people who can afford to do that, so everyone else might as well go home. Right? It's 100 people now, that's, Ubisoft laughs at that, what, they can't do anything with 100 people.
Yeah, it's that's quaint.
Yeah.
So what games were your What games were your big like inspirations? Like what did you want to make games that were like what did you play when you were growing up that made you want to make games?
I don't know. Like probably Infocom text adventures were the biggest thing. I never really made one of those.
Yeah, those seem pretty different from anything that you've worked on.
Yeah,
conceptually, but I guess maybe The Witness is going to be the closest thing.
Yeah, it's
like,
so far.
I know it is.
You can't even.
But like just as far as like everything else seems even further. You know what I mean? But I digress.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, I
guess that you were into like NetHack and like roguelikes and shit like that.
A little bit. I did some of that in college. I liked Sokoban in college. But I liked NetTrek. That was my favorite game in college. Played a lot of that. Many when I should have been, studying or being productive.
Well, because you're a competitive gaming dude. I don't know. I don't know if you talked about it publicly or if it was just when we were chatting one time, but like you played a fuck ton of like Counter-Strike and were really good at it.
I was really good at Counter-Strike. I mean, for an amateur player, right? I couldn't have been a pro player or something.
Right. But that said, like it's I find that interesting just in the sense of, again, very different, I think, from what I probably associate with, what you make, and therefore extrapolate what your interests would be. It's like, Counter-Strike and like competitive Star Trek football and stuff.
I don't know. Something changed there, but my first game that I was telling you about was like that, right? It was like hover tanks with like lots of different weapons. Right. Tactics, strategy, like all in a big burrito. So something changed, burrito. Right? At some point, I decided I wanted to make different stuff. Yeah. So among the many other things that happened between that first company and when I started doing Braid, one of the things was around 2002, I think. Mm-hmm. Whatever year that really good eclipse was in Africa, which I think was 2002. I was flying back from Africa because we went to see this eclipse. Yeah. It's a whole story of its own.
I mean, it sounds fascinating, but...
And I get inspired sometimes when I travel because, you're relaxed, you're not thinking about and your subconscious can go to work. And I was coming back and I was like, I want to do this thing that facilitates, gameplay experimentation and shows the work of people who are doing crazy stuff. And I took pages and pages of notes. I wrote a little sort of a manifesto about it that I never cleaned up and put anywhere. But so that's when I started this experimental gameplay workshop, and I got Chris Hecker and Doug Church and Robin Huneke to help on that, and we did that. So now Robin and Daniel Benmergui are doing it, but we four did it for probably 8 years in a row, and that was all about just looking around over the course of the year to find the most interesting, out of the mainstream kind of games that people were doing. Yeah. Even if they weren't totally successful games, if the idea, if at the heart of it was interesting and different and came to some conclusion, it would be, a good thing to talk about. Yeah. And so,
at some point in there, in 2006 or something, you showed Braid in that, right?
Yeah, I actually showed Braid 3 years in a row. It's a little bit bad form, but whatever. I had new things to show.
Yeah. Well, I remember the first time that I encountered you or Braid was my first GDC I went to was 2006, and I went to experimental gameplay sessions. And weirdly, sort of weirdly, you showed Braid stuff, and it was all programmer art, and you actually showed and explained the ending story twist that goes backwards and everything. And so I had that weird feeling when I played Braid that I've normally only had when I play games that I worked on, where it's just I can't see that moment as an outsider. I have no idea what the impact is. No, and that's fine. I'm whatever. I have a differently interesting experience, which is that's that thing you talked about, and it's in the game and it's finished, and clearly for other people they extrapolated the intended meaning that you had explained at that thing years prior, and it worked for them and everything. But it was interesting for me.
In retrospect, when I look at something like that, I was really excited about that, and I was like, I want to show this and talk about it. But really, I don't think that was necessary, because a lot more people played the game than were in that room. And if you're a designer and you play the game, you probably pick up on that and know. So it's an interesting... I'm kind of down on conferences a little bit these days. Like, I don't think I'm going to go to the GDC this year.
You're not even going to go.
No. I mean, I live here, right? So I might just meet up with people
that's true.
And stuff.
Right. Everybody's coming to your house, so you can hang out with them, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but I kind of don't, I don't get that much from most of the lectures.
Yeah.
If I miss something, it's online on video. And if I'm going to give a lecture, which I've gone through phases where I go and give a lot of speeches. That's another thing I was doing, like, all in that period before Braid even.
Right.
When I do that, I find it useful, first of all, because it's kind of how I figure out what I actually think about subjects, right?
Yeah.
If having to verbalize it helps me realize where I'm at.
Yeah.
So it's a useful process for me, but I don't need a conference to do that, right? Like, you can, like, I could, like those design meetings we were doing a couple of years ago, I could get one of those together and, like, hey, I just want to do a speech and have a real audience, and we're just going to record it and put it on the web.
Yeah.
But, hey, let's do this thing, and it doesn't cost me $2,500 to attend that, or, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I find that at the very least having concrete external deadlines is helpful for me to actually, like, get that kind of work done, for somebody else to be saying, here's the date you need to have your stuff, like, presentable by. And I mean, if you give yourself that deadline and you're like, we're going to do this thing in a month, then now you've got a month to do it for your own thing, and you're not going to move it, like, sure. But yeah, like, because that does seem like so, like, in between the point of your first company shutting down and then starting work on Braid, and you worked on Braid for, like, a few years. 3.5, yeah. So, like, it wasn't like a gap from the end of the 90s to, like, 2008. It was, like, 2004 or 5 or something. But in between, yeah, you were doing talks, and were you, like, the impression I get is you were doing, like, contracting stuff? Like,
I was doing contracting stuff on a number of different AAA-ish games. So I worked on Oddworld Munch's Odyssey.
A launch title for the Xbox One, I think.
Xbox One,
right,
or whatever.
The original Xbox.
The original Xbox.
You want to hear the? So I had this realization. Sorry, when I was talking to my friends earlier while I was here, I realized the reason they don't give a shit about the Xbox One, the new one versus the old one, is the majority of their target audience is not old enough to remember having an Xbox One.
That's possible. It's possible. I don't know.
Dark,
that whole thing. I don't.
No, it's a weird thing.
It's a big weird thing.
Okay,
so I worked on that. I worked on Deus Ex 2 and Thief 3, on a little bit on the tech team there. I worked on a few other things. I didn't really do that great of a job on any of those, relative to what I should have done, right?
Were you just, like, not feeling motivated? Or as a
contractor? It was the same thing that would happen in school. Like, at the beginning, I'd be super motivated. It's different in every situation, right? So actually, at the Oddworld thing, I showed up the first day, and I showed up, like, Friday night, right? So Saturday morning, I go in the office, and of course, there's no one there, and I'm like, oh, I'll just get started, because I'm hyped. I want to get down, sit down, and like, they had this thing there where they didn't let people mess with their own PCs, so the PCs were all, like, locked down and stuff. And so I had this fire to get started working on the game. I'm like, fuck it, I'm going to break into my own PC so I can, like, get the game on it and get going. And I spent all weekend trying to do that, like 8 or 10 hours each day. And at the end of it, I, like, give up. And then Monday, I'm, like, really tired and beat down and, like, it's like the worst. And that's a weird attitude. Like, in a lot of ways, that company treated its employees very well, but, like, not, especially for a programmer, like, if you're not being trusted to use your own computer properly, it's weird. It's really weird.
I mean, that must have been an interesting part of doing contracting, is you essentially, got to experience the working environment of, like, a number of different productions in a short period of time.
But actually, also the other thing, it's all these things are useful. Even though I didn't do that great of a job on these things, they were useful. So, in terms of figuring out what I think about production processes and all that.
Sure.
So when I was working on Deus Ex 2 on this tech team, I sort of came in, as a contractor to help out, and I wasn't even getting paid hardly anything because I didn't want that I was just like, hey, I'll just hang out and work on this. But because of that, I also was not in a decision-making position at all, which is really demoralizing when you don't think that
good decisions are being made necessarily. No, sure.
And the other thing about that was back in the days when a lot of games, you change something and you hit compile, and 45 minutes later you get to run the game, and then 20 minutes later you're in the game and get to test your thing.
Yeah.
And I get super demoralized in that kind of situation. And so everything we do here, if you compile The Witness from scratch, it takes, I measured it just the other day, it takes like 45 seconds or something. The whole thing, clean build, which is not incremental.
Which is insane. I mean,
well, it could be much faster if we actually worked on it, but, we make, but
at the point where the whole game is 45 seconds, probably the work to make it 35 seconds is not really worth it.
Although it does, it helps.
I mean, 10 seconds really add up over time, but like, compared to a lot of times to build the whole game is hours, even now, like, it's...
Yeah, I mean, really there's some kind of cliff around 2 minutes, right? Like, there's a cliff before where, okay, I'm hitting compile and I'm still here because it's just going to take a second, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm hitting compile and now I'm going to get a coffee. As soon as you go get a coffee, your flow is broken and all that stuff.
And the 2 minutes turns into 10 minutes because it doesn't matter 2 minutes anymore. You come back to your desk whenever,
Yeah. So that actually, that was the Ion Storm thing, which was a company doing Deus Ex 2 and Thief 3. That was really frustrating for a lot of reasons. It was a hard environment to deal with. But right before I left there, I actually started doing better. Like I found some tasks that I could do that were more feasible. And so I did something that seemed hard in like a couple days. And I was like, all right, cool, peace out, I'm out of here.
Sure.
But yeah, that was, it was easy to sort of be depressed at that time because I was like, look, I'm supposedly this really smart person who's a really good programmer and all this, and yet I keep doing this thing over and over where I go to a place and I'll be really smart at the beginning, and then I'll just sort of be in this demoralization spiral until things get really bad, right?
Yeah.
And now I have a clear picture of that, and I realize that what was going on is that that's just my mind saying, hey, you shouldn't be here. You should be doing something else.
Sure. Yeah.
This is not the right way for your life to go, right? And it makes your life go a different way by kicking you out of those situations, right?
Yeah, because you make yourself incapable of being in that situation. Like, you might motivate other people to eject you from that situation, or, for yourself.
Or just eject yourself or whatever.
Untenable,
yeah. But at that time, I didn't understand that.
Yeah. And
so it sucked extra,
Yeah.
But eventually then, I was back working on Braid, and I started that game around the beginning of 2004.
Okay.
Although actually I had a previous project to finish up. That one actually went pretty well too. So right before Braid, there was a research project that I did with a guy named Atman Binstock, who's now doing a thing at Valve. And we basically pitched this thing. So IBM, the Cell processor, which was in the PlayStation 3, was like a joint project between IBM, Toshiba, I think, and Sony, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was Toshiba. Yeah. Anyway, so before the PS3 was out, right? So all of these different partners had plans for what they wanted to do with this massively revolutionary chip. And IBM was like, we can build servers because that's what we know how to do, and we'll just slot a bunch of these in there, and you'll just have a crap load of compute power. But they didn't know who to sell that to, right? And one of the possible markets is video games, and I happened to be introduced to people there at the right time, so I went there and pitched them like, okay, we're going to do a proof of concept for an online game that's about giant robots, right? Like attacking a town, but they're physically locomoting, right?
Like
so
physics
they're like hexapods and stuff.
Yeah.
And because they're physically locomoting, you fight them by like shooting limbs off the giant robot, and it'll like fall and things like that.
Yeah.
And because it's a multiplayer game, right? Everyone needs to see the same world consistently, which means you can't do physics locally on the client because everyone will get different results.
Yeah.
So to do that kind of game with coherency, the server has to be running all the physics for all this stuff at once, and that has to be a beefy server. So like I came up with this thing. Who knows if it would be a kind of game that really exists, but it was at least a case of like, look, this is a thing that couldn't exist without Big Iron like running it.
Okay.
You know, and so we built that. Like, and again, we were crazy productive for like a year, and we built a game.
Crazy multiplayer physics robot game.
Multiplayer physics robot game. Actually, yeah. And it was extra crazy because like Ottman. So I was doing the client and the like the graphics and the gameplay code, and Ottman did all the physics. Like he wrote a physics engine and made it run, with the inner loops in, assembly language on a chip that was barely existing. And we did all that in a year.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
At the end of it, though, our report was, this chip is not good for video games. And they didn't like that.
Yeah.
Like our conclusion was we would have rather been doing this on Intel chips by a lot,
Yeah.
And they didn't like that conclusion. So I think it got buried, sadly.
So it was never a public thing. It was
never a public thing. We actually, it was better. So the first E3, so we finished this like a year before the E3 when games for the PS3 were first shown, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And what we had a year before that was better than some stuff that was on the E3 show floor. It was crazy, right? We had such a head start. But like we brought it to EA, for example, and showed it to a bunch of people at EA, and they were like, yeah, we're not impressed. We'll totally. And then, a year later, they've got nothing, right?
Right.
But it's good, though. It's good that I didn't rat hole on a game about Space Marines with jetpacks. You had jetpacks, so you could like fly up and like run,
like stand on the robots.
Yeah,
sounds like. Experientially, it sounds like fun. I would run on top of a robot. I don't know.
Yeah,
whatever,
it was
right?
cool. The thing is, because it was a small team thing, it didn't quite have that. It didn't have that level of polish that makes things really fun that you get when you just put all that last 80% of the work in, right?
Yeah.
It was only the first 80%.
Right.
But it was really cool, and so we did that, and then I actually had to finish that up at the beginning of 2004. But then around April 2004, I started working on Braid, and by December 2004, I basically finished the game, gameplay-wise. So that was like 8 months.
So
pretty intensive.
I think the thing that people remember about Braid, I think.
Wait, I'm saying 2004. That's not right. 2006.
I thought you said it took like 3.5 years.
2005.
If it came out in 2008 and it took 3.5 years, then 8, 7, 6, 2005.
I always get confused about the years. Some year in there.
Let's
it might
say
have been 05.
2005, probably. Let's go with probably. I mean, you showed that sequence from
It would have been 05, right? So
it's that sequence from Braid at GDC 06 in March, so you must have been working on the game for a while before that, but not 2 years. Yeah. So, okay. I think that, again, I'm extrapolating like public perception, but I think the thing that people mostly remember about Braid mechanically is the first world, which is time rewind, just straight up, you can rewind and go back. Yeah. But then you had additional worlds where there was like the time bubble, and there was stuff that only moved when you moved. Was all of that stuff like in and playable in that first year of development? All those different mechanics.
I believe they were.
Yeah.
The reason is, I remember in December of that year was when I did the ending. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure the ending came after all that other stuff.
You kind of built it in order, as far as like...
Roughly. At first I didn't know, how many worlds are there going to be and whatever. And at some point, in November, I was like, I want this game to be tractable because I want to finish it, right?
Yeah.
So, in addition to doing all that contracting stuff and all those intermediate years, I also spent a lot of time, working on my own independent projects. They would be mostly technically driven projects, though. I'm going to do a really technically impressive thing and build a game around it. Because I had a history as a programmer, and that's the way programmers think. That's the way cowboy programmers want to live their life. I
have a cool feature I can implement, and then I'll figure out how to use that in a fun way.
Yeah, but feature is a little too small of a word, right? It's I'm going to do something that nobody else in the world knows how to do, and it's going to be really impressive, and that's going to help me make a game, right?
Sure.
But because I'm very ambitious, all the things I picked during that period were too hard for me to do.
Okay.
And you could kind of get them working, but games need to be super robust, and often these things are not that robust. So again, that was a super good learning experience, but no products that people could play came out of it.
Right.
And so one of the mission statements when I started Braid was, look, I've done all this 3D stuff, hardcore, software, assembly language, whatever. I'm gonna now do a 2D game, because that'll minimize the amount of time that I spend programming, and I'll be able to focus on design.
Yeah.
So that's...
did you find that was the case?
It was the case, and yet even so, I barely was able to finish Braid. I was at my wit's end at the end of the project.
Because from the outside, it does I don't know. On the one hand, as a developer, I can kind of picture the answer to this, but on the other hand, it still seems amorphous as to if you had the game playable end to end in a year. Did that include did the puzzles mostly stay? Was the content there?
They got revised a lot over the subsequent years, and the feel of the game was not super good and all that, and we didn't have, there wasn't even parallax scrolling at that time or anything, whereas the final game had all sorts of stuff. But the basics, if you want to say what the basics of the game are, you have a hub world, you go out to these other worlds, and those worlds have different mechanics of what's happening. All that was in there in the first year, first 8 months, really.
And so then from that point forward, you were, in a word, making it viable from making the mechanics feel better and making the presentation be more attractive. And then working with David Hellman and musicians and stuff.
Yeah, once David came on, I ended up doing a lot of programming to support what he was
the graphical stuff.
Yeah.
Because, so David Hellman was, am I right, the only artist that did the art in the game?
Not really.
Okay.
No.
He defined the look of the game and did a lot of the art, right?
So before he was, I forget exactly what order things happened in, but Edmund McMillan actually did the animations for the characters and did character design on them, right?
I see.
And so for a long time, we had Edmund's characters and David's backdrops, and what happened at the end was I was looking at it and I was just okay, this was the way that we could get the work done, but man, they don't mesh that well.
Yeah.
So I had to call Edmund up and say, I hate to say this, but we're going to have David paint over your stuff to have the style match. And then, David also made some in-between frames, because it turned out, we want the animation to be at a higher frame rate. So he basically took Edmund's animation stuff that he did and massaged it substantially.
Okay. But so you worked with a small number of artists over a significant amount of time, and put a lot of work into supporting them and making the game feel more playable. And I assume also at the end doing stuff to make it comply with Microsoft's requirements for Xbox.
Oh yeah, that was a great deal of work right there.
For
sure.
I imagine so, especially in 2008, where they were Braid was one of, I feel the early games in a transitional point from Microsoft Xbox Live Arcade called that because they were going to sell you fucking Joust.
Yes.
And went from that to we're going to have original content that creators are making for this platform,
Yeah.
And so there was probably a lot of poorly supported stuff that you had to do to be on that platform at that time.
Yeah. No, it was terrible. I hope they've made it better this time, but I doubt it.
Yeah, I don't know. Because there's at least in that generation, they had all those goofy requirements. They're you have to have leaderboards, and you have to.
It's way okay. There's all that stuff is bad, right? But there's even worse stuff. So there's all these
console cert in general, where it's unplug the memory card while you're playing.
Yeah. Well, there's all this stuff. So I don't give a crap about achievements at all, right?
Sure.
There's all this stuff in there. Not even just about supporting achievements, but in making sure that achievements are secure so that there's no way you can load your friend's save game and get their achievements, right? So there's all sorts of crazy stuff that people can try to do and swap users on a different menu. And in theory, the operating system should have just handled all that. Like, you shouldn't have to care about that as a game, actually, right?
But instead they offloaded.
They didn't build it that way, and then they put that onus on all the developers.
Yeah.
It's so bad. So here's how bad it is, right? So, on Xbox Live, you have a unique identifier for your account. It's like a big number, right? It's a standard thing to do. Everyone has their own big number.
Sure.
Actually, there's 2 different big numbers based on whether you're locally logged in or connected to the network, and that makes it really confusing, first of all.
Yeah.
But actually, all the code that you call in the operating system to make things happen doesn't use that number. It uses the user index, which is 0 to 3 based on what controller people are using. So when you say load the save game file for this person, you say for user 0, which, by the way, can flip out beneath your program at the wrong time.
Yeah.
So it's actually, I believe, completely impossible to do what they want to make it secure. It's just that, I don't know.
Yeah.
If they had just retooled their API to use the big unique number, all that stuff would have just worked. But instead, every developer has to do 3 or 4 weeks of work.
Yeah. I mean, I would hope that
happen.
It's one of those things where I would hope that in the current, there would be some lessons learned going into the next generation.
You would think, but the thing is,
I have no idea.
There are some, actually. I got my PS4, ran Resident on it. First thing it did, it popped up a calibration screen, like, let's make sure this is sized for your TV, right? Previous consoles didn't do that.
Oh, so that was
that was something I ranted about a few months ago,
right?
Because one of the requirements that you always have to comply with is called title safe region, where it's like, you're not allowed to draw important information on the outer 10% of the screen, which makes games suck, because then you have all these HUD elements and stuff, and they're like way towards the middle,
attached to the edges of the screen.
And you've got all this wasted space, right?
So the calibration screen you saw was actually
it's built into the PS4,
level thing. That's cool.
So I'm hoping that means you don't have to do title safe region on the PS4, but I haven't looked at the cert requirements.
So you're working on Braid for a long time.
Yeah.
Like, what was? I mean, I get the feeling that I know some of this, I guess, but what, and maybe you've answered this too many times, but what was the inspiration for the game? Like, what was the thing that motivated? What made it interesting enough for you to commit those years of your life to actually finish it?
Well, at first it was an experiment, right? And at that point it wasn't clearly the thing for me to do, right? But one of the germs of the experiment was, some friends of mine were talking on a mailing list, small mailing list with 20 or 30 people on it. And there was a discussion about rewind in games, among other things, because Prince of Persia: Sands of Time had been out for a while at that point, and
which had limited rewind.
Yeah, you would
it had 100. It had 100% fidelity rewind. You'd rewind everything in the game when you were rewinding it. It was just you had to use it.
Yeah, I don't really believe it was 100% fidelity. I think they faked a lot of things. But
from the players, and all the important
seemed
stuff
reasonable.
Right? And they didn't have a lot of stuff that would be hard to do that with. They didn't have physics objects.
I don't think
physics backwards.
I don't think they did sound backwards or anything. But anyway, my big issue with that was, I played that game and I thought, oh, that's a really great idea. That's do some rewind. That's cool. It wasn't even the first game to do rewind. There was I forget the name of this game now. Anyway, there was a first-person shooter, mildly RPG-ish game where you played an angel or something.
Oh, I know what you mean. No, it wasn't Messiah, because that was another
not
game.
That,
it was it was that one that was 1996 and kind of Quake 1, 2-ish kind of engine.
I don't think it was
shit.
That early. I don't know. I don't remember.
It might have been 98, but I know what you mean. You play an Archangel and you had a bunch of powers. And
and one of the powers you could rewind.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
So anyway, rewind had been around a little bit, and what I personally felt was that it designers didn't see the potential in it, right? Because just to take Prince of Persia as the scapegoat here, right? They took a system that was already complicated and cumbersome, a base system, which is this thing about I'm playing a game, I try to do some challenges, the game kills me when I fail the challenges, and if I die a few times, it's game over, and then I go to the loading screen, and I load, and I wait 2 minutes while it loads, and then I'm back where I was, and I try to do the same thing, and I die, and, that is, it's an annoying thing to happen interactively while you're playing, and a lot of it is like vestiges from arcade games,
right.
Yeah.
Like
if you just started from scratch and you were building a fantasy adventure game modeled after like the movies or something, your main character doesn't die and come back in a movie. Like, why would you do that in a game? It doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
The reason it makes sense is historical mostly. So you could imagine starting with a different set of assumptions that would mean that the failure state didn't result in your character dying, but like some other consequences, which is things that games, start to play with sometimes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I felt like they took this thing that could have been a beautiful simplification on top of that ugliness, that traditional ugliness, but they just bolted it in there as an extra layer and thus made it uglier, right? So now it's like, oh, if you screw up, now you can rewind, but only if you have sand.
Right.
And when you run out of sand, then you die, and then you reload. So we've made this more complicated, and in some sense, it makes the sand not matter because it's only doing...
It's temporarily keeping you from having to go to a load screen as opposed to being...
Yeah, it wasn't that interesting, ultimately, but it was potentially interesting.
Yeah.
But so there was this discussion on the list, and my friend Casey, who often has opinions that people would consider extremist, he was just like, look, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to rewind any game, just like a VCR or whatever. You just hit the button and go backwards, and that's just how it works. And of course, someone else on the list was saying, well, no, you can't do that because then you completely get rid of consequence. And there was this discussion about it, right? Like, well, if this cumbersome save load is the only thing giving you consequence, you're really getting around the consequence by loading your save game anyway.
Yeah.
And then it sucks if you forgot to save and all these things. I mean, we didn't have that much autosave back then, by the way, for anyone listening now. You had to manually save most of the time.
The F5 key.
If that. Like, sometimes you had to go into the menu and save to know that... Anyway... There was this whole discussion, and everyone had different opinions, and of course people didn't really change each other's opinions that much, but no one ever, tried it.
Yeah.
And I was like, what would it be like if I made a game about rewind, right? That was one of the ideas.
Yeah.
But that wasn't even the idea I started with to make Braid. That was just in the background. Like, I didn't then go off and say, okay, I'm going to make a rewind game. It was just like, okay, that's a thought.
Yeah.
The actual thing I wanted to do... I was on vacation in Thailand, and I was like, let me make a game, because again, I get inspired when I'm on vacation. I was like, let me make a game that's like this book that I like a lot, that's called Invisible Cities. It's by Italo Calvino. It has a structure where there's a bunch of little vignettes, like 3 or 4 page. They're not even stories, they're like descriptions of a city that have a certain theme about them, right? And I thought that was a really beautiful book. There's a book that was a follow-up to that, not a follow-up, but an homage to that, called Einstein's Dreams, written by Alan Lightman, who's a physicist at MIT, right? And it was a similar structure, but Einstein's Dreams is about Albert Einstein, going to sleep and thinking about different ways that the universe might work. Back when, he's working by day as a patent clerk, he's not a famously known physicist yet. He's working on his theories, and he's dreaming about the way things could be. Yeah. But again, it's in the format where there's a 3 or 4 page bit that assumes, like, what if light is really slow and you could walk faster than it, and here's how people would interact in that world, right? Yeah. Or whatever. And that was a really interesting idea, but it struck me that if you're going to do that, if you're going to do the physics version of, like, Invisible Cities, books are the wrong place to do it, because in books you could only... And the wrong place to do it is too strong, right? But it's not in the wheelhouse of books, right?
Yeah, there is greater potential to actually demonstrate it in an interactive way.
Yes. Games are the place where you say, okay, what if light traveled really slow? Let's actually make it travel really slow and see what happens, right? Yeah. So when you're someone like Alan Lightman, you can kind of use your imagination to think of what's going to happen, but you're going to miss things. I know this for a fact, because when I go and do it in games, most of the interesting stuff is things I didn't think about a priori. Right. so I wanted to do that. And my idea was I want to take some of the weird stuff from quantum mechanics, right, about things not being definitely in a state like they're in a superposition, or there's this interesting fact about how when you look at the laws of physics, even Newtonian physics, but quantum mechanics also, they appear to be time invariant. So like physics doesn't seem to know the difference between time running forward and time running backward. So it's like, how do you design a game where that's true? There's this thing called the principle of least action, which is one of the weirdest. Well, it's maybe not so weird once you understand it in a certain way, but it's one of the most interesting and possibly profound things in physics, which is that, we think about physics as being essentially about cause and effect. Like this billiard ball hit that one and knocked it over there and whatever, right? But when you look at any physical system, when you zoom out and look at it, if you look at, just imagine we're talking about the line of like where something went. Like some you think about an asteroid in the solar system, and it went this way and it got tugged on by this one, and then it went that way and makes this crazy curve, right?
Right. Gravitational pull on.
Yeah,
sure.
So when you zoom out and you look at the path of that asteroid, it's always the minimum energy way to get from its starting point to its ending point.
Right.
Which is crazy. It's like saying that whole path wasn't the result of any actions because it was the only thing that could have ever been, sort of, right?
Yeah, like the idea that
you start getting teleological a little bit.
Because it's like it's the optimal thing that could have happened. Therefore, it's the only thing that could have happened because only the optimal thing will ever happen. Like
and that's what we're saying now is an overly simplistic way to put it, right? But
I mean, from my point of view, I'm parroting back your simplification of this thing, but I mean it seems to make sense at least in that form as you're explaining.
So anyway, I had a bunch of ideas like that. And
I've how to systematize that stuff, of how to make those into rules in a game world that you can then understand and react to,
And so I was thinking about that stuff, and at first the ideas about how to do that didn't seem to be that high quality. Like they were interesting, but I wasn't loving them. And then I remembered the rewind thing, and I was like, okay, let me try the rewind thing. And that turned out to work really well. So within this first week that I was working on this game on vacation, I built the rewind. So first I built a basic platformer, right? And I built in rewind, and then I built in objects that were immune to your rewind, and I think I might have even done, the time tied to your position, or that might have been the next week or something, right? But in that first week to 2 weeks, I had a game that demonstrated a lot of what was interesting about the final game. And once I did that, I was like, that's better than all these other ideas. So I'm just going to make this game about the rewind and seeing where the rewind goes.
Yeah.
So that to me is always a good sign. Like you start out with one thing that would be pretty good if you built that, but then you find a thing that's better. That's how you know you're really doing well.
Right.
When you love the new thing enough to get rid of your old ideas and say this is better, right? Because the thing. So let me sidetrack for a second, right? So another game company that people like a lot is Valve, right? And Valve has a culture. So what I do here, what I was doing with Braid by de facto, because I was the only person working on it until Dave came on, and what I'm doing with The Witness now with a bigger team is sort of this, designer is sort of the benevolent dictator, right? Where like they're determining what the game is, right? People can have ideas about what to contribute with the game, and you need that actually to fill out a big game.
Yeah.
But, it's my job to make sure that those work with the large vision, and if they don't, then I decide, I'm sorry, we can't do that, right? Or we can do something like this, but we need to change it in this other way, right?
Yeah.
So Valve explicitly, and they've said this on a number of occasions, doesn't believe in that, right?
Yeah.
They believe in just iterating on a product. They call their things products, which I don't really, I said product earlier in a different way, but they believe that games get better the more people you have working on them. And when, you have one person who's a designer trying to be the benevolent dictator, that'll ultimately go wrong, right? Because that person is fallible. And in fact, all through games, you see people who were like that and did a shitty game and whatever. Right?
Maybe they did one good game and then they tried to do it again and
couldn't do it or whatever. Right. So from one standpoint, what they're doing is totally rational and reasonable. I don't like it because I believe that it puts the majority of interesting games outside the scope of what you can do. Right. Because if you're going to actually be visionary and interesting, you have to be able to pursue something without having to politically convince 100 people that that's the right thing.
Right.
You have to, if it's really a new contribution, you have to show people why it's the right thing, right?
And if it's going to be an expression, I don't know, the many games that I connect with strongly are clearly an expression of an individual's personal experience or interest or whatever, in a way that is really hard when it's committee.
When everything is vote on what goes in the game, right?
Which isn't to say that checks and balances are bad, but like, yes, I know what you mean.
Yeah, so, but the thing that I realize now that at least helps you from turning into the crazy designer who sucks is this reality check of, is what I'm doing now better than my original idea, right? At some point, you give up the selfish ego part of the idea and you just say, I'm going to do the best thing. And it's probably not possible to do that completely, but you can do a pretty good job of it, right? And Braid turned out that way, and The Witness is largely that way as well.
Is there anyone in your process that is like your go-to second opinion, like your filter sounding board?
No, there probably could be in the future. It takes a long time for people to get on the same page as me, right?
Sure.
So to even really understand what we're doing,
because I mean, coming from where you're talking about, like on the one hand, when I've been working on stuff, it's like, okay, I'm the writer, and the designer, I take final responsibility for like whatever goes on screen, like it's my fault, and therefore, on some level, it's like I'm that. That filter you're talking about, where it's like, this is an idea that just won't fit with what we need to be doing, and this is, how we could change it to be that, or whatever. But the other side of that for me is, kind of a local maximum problem, where it's like, I can go in a room and be like, I think I have found the best version of this that I can think of, and then my, like, story editor, creative partner, whatever, at the studio is Carla, and I will bring that to her, and either here's the thing that I legitimately think is the best and I'm confident in, or here's as far as I could get and I don't know what the fuck I'm doing anymore. And for someone like that to be able to say, like, I don't think that's actually going to be good enough, or, well, that gives me an idea you wouldn't have had, like, I think that's also very helpful.
That kind of thing happens here, but there's not necessarily a main person, but it's more like, I'll be, the way the game ends up working in terms of the way the modelers and texturers work on it is people tend to own relatively large areas, right? It's a common way to structure it.
Right.
So we have this big island, and there's 11 or 12 or 14. I don't know how many like areas on it, and then there's sort of a main person who's working on those most of the time. And so when I'm trying to design something that fits into an area, it's like I'll be working with that person, and they'll have a problem, or I'll have a problem, and I'll start talking to them, and I'll say, like, here's generally an idea that I have that I would like to try, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. Like, sometimes the idea kind of sucks, right? Sometimes it's fine, and sometimes the idea itself is not that good, but it leads to the other person thinking of something better, right? Like, the important part is to factor the ego part out of it and just say, like, look, if I'm thinking of my own, where if you wanted to be the egotistical designer, that your brilliant ideas are always good, how do the brilliant ideas happen in the first place? Well, you start thinking about possibilities. It's not like magically the final idea just drops into your head all the time. Yeah. On rare occasions that does happen for me, but often I'm looking at a situation, I'm trying to figure out what's the best thing, right? Yeah. And I propose things to myself, and some of them I reject out of hand, some of them I investigate a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Some of them I just say, that's not the game that we're making, some of them not, right? So in this kind of process, you're just opening that loop up and including another person in there. So there's nothing to be ashamed of in that, right? It's the same process. It's just involving more people. Now, the problem, of course, is when it involves more people, it's much slower.
Yeah.
And
well, I think also the point in that loop where you involve more people is important. Because I think that when you are saying, I'm going to be the first line of defense to a design problem or what we're going to do with the story or whatever, then I think brainstorming is pretty bad. I think, if
I don't like
you're
brainstorming.
Like, yeah, you're like, well, I know what the problem is. I haven't even thought about what a solution might be, but let's talk about that. I think that's going to fuck up your process and make it slower and worse in in ways that are specific to bringing additional people in at that point in the process versus I've gotten as far as I think I can. And now having someone be able to react to that, I think, can be really valuable.
Absolutely. Yeah, and sometimes time is just useful, right? Like, we're stuck on this, but we don't need to solve it right now, so we'll come back to it later. And then later you just know, right?
Yeah, sleeping on it or getting out of your workspace. Or,
That's an interesting big difference between this game and Braid, because Braid was small enough that it didn't need that much of what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
But The Witness is huge in comparison. There's just so much stuff that I can't hold it all in my own head. So, and so the nature of problem solving becomes a little different, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, speaking of that, like, you finished Braid, and it was really, like, well received, and you went on many platforms, and it sold a lot of copies, and, like, you're employing a bunch of people now, and, like, all that kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
So, like, one thing that I wonder is, you have your first big independent project that you ship and is like a noteworthy success, and clearly, whatever, not to be too crass about it, but you suddenly have a lot of money, and then it seems like two decisions you could make as someone in that position are either, well, I will kind of do essentially the same scale of thing that I did before, but try to do it differently and interestingly, or you can say, I'm now going to invest the majority or some large part of these resources I've just gained to do something that in scope is significantly larger. And it seems like you definitely went down the path of like, I'm not going to make another 2D game that's interesting for different reasons. It's like full 3D.
Well, there's a third option, right? Which was, I want to do a 3D ambitious thing, but not pay for it. So I'm going to get funding from someone, which I can do now that I have a reputation from this previous game.
Or you could also do the cheaper version where, like, on The Witness, you guys are programming your own engine, right?
Yeah.
So you could have used, like, middleware or something, which...
Yeah.
I mean, I know
which comes with appropriate
I know that
trade-offs.
you wouldn't want to as, like, your personality type, but it would just be a different way to, like, get into that experiential space with a lower...
Faster
upfront.
and with a lower upfront thing,
So what made you... Like, what pulled you towards like, going much bigger and having, like, a company with many more people at it and all that?
Well, it was really just this game, right? So even before Braid was done, I started getting the ideas for this game and writing them down, and I worked on it a bit during the time between when Braid was in the can, so to speak, and when it actually came out. There was about a 6-week delay. Mm-hmm. And then after, or that summer and later, I would actually go over to Chris Hecker's house and we'd have little work parties, and he was actually starting Spy Party at that time. And so we'd sort of show each other what we were doing, and...
You guys going to co-launch these games? Are they both finally going to come out?
Yeah, that's kind of scary. Well, he's actually got an open beta, right? So you can play Spy Party at this point.
Yeah. Your game is not really The Witness
it's
is
not open
beta.
No. No.
Yeah.
So, what was I saying? Okay, we were doing that, and so I put in a good 3 or 4 months on it solid. Sort of. I mean, I was burnt out from Braid. So
was that very soon? That was like...
That was like right after...
Okay.
Yeah, I couldn't work on Braid. I couldn't touch Braid.
Right.
Like, oh my god.
But just even diving back into real work on something that quickly
well,
daunting.
I also was intensively kung fu training at the time, so that like ate the rest of my time.
Have you done like martial arts and stuff for a long time?
No, I did it. I did martial art, or I started going to a kung fu school at the same time I started working on Braid, and then I was doing that for a couple years, 2.5 years, in a kind of a casual way, the way most people do it, which is, a couple days a week, you go in for a couple hours, do some stuff.
You learn
and then at some point they come along and say, well, why don't you come into our closed door training and you'll get like the serious training, but by the way, it's much more of a commitment, right?
Yeah.
You end up training like 15 hours a week or something. That's even low, but that's probably what the average was for me. So it's sort of like a part-time job at that point.
Yeah. That's a significant.
So I was doing that in 2007 and 2008. So when Braid shipped, I was actually in the most intensive part of that. That was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, was that something that you felt like you
but the reason I brought that up,
is
before we go on, is
sure.
Most people, when they have a successful game that makes money and stuff, they'll okay, now I can just go travel the world or just relax and leave. And I couldn't do that because I was in this intensive part-time job.
I see.
So, and that was going to be going for like another year and a half at least. It was a multi-year commitment. So it's like, well, why didn't I start another game while I'm here?
Right.
Yeah.
Was it just something you were interested in because it was? I mean, it's a very different discipline to what you are normally doing on a computer and stuff. Or?
Yeah. And I don't know. I just really liked it. I didn't like it that much at first, but I tend to not give up on things. And once you get kind of good at it, it's just really interesting. It puts you. So I grew up as a very nerdy nerd, right? Actually, it turns out, looking at old pictures of me and stuff, I always had a relatively physical body type, but I never understood that.
Yeah.
I always thought of myself as like super scrawny nerd, and everyone around you thinks of you the way you think of you usually, right? Like you just radiate that.
Yeah.
And so, I got picked on in school all the time, and I was used to like being that person who like wouldn't, if somebody started a fight with you, you just kind of give up or run away. Like, what do you do, right?
Yeah.
And so that's fine, but then there's always some existential worry. Like, what if I had to protect someone or something really bad happens? I am helpless in that situation, right? A lot of people are in that category of people. And in fact, in San Francisco, for example, one day I was on a bus and it wouldn't have been wise to intervene even if I knew how to fight, but 4 guys just suddenly grab a guy on the bus and drag him off and just start kicking the shit out of him in the street.
Jesus.
Like, right there, and the bus driver's yelling at him. There's like 15 other people on the bus. Nobody stops this from happening or anything. And it's like, what is going on? This is crazy.
Yeah.
So, the interesting thing about it, one of the most motivating, there's several things that are really good, right? But one, the end part of this anecdote is just that it moves you into a different class of person where, like, anytime you fight, it's dangerous, right? So even if you know how to fight, you could easily lose or get hurt or whatever.
Yeah.
But it at least moves you into a different class of person where it's like, you who are trying to intimidate me, your plan is not going to go the way that you thought it was. I'm at least going to give you some trouble. And that, it's a tremendous existential relief, right? It's also a good way to get yourself in trouble if you take it too seriously. But
but you at least you have that knowledge. It's like, I have this ability to act differently in a situation that I would not have had before. Which,
And then, and that fade, like, I haven't done Kung Fu training for a while because I got in a car accident, and so that ability fades over time. So now if I got in a fight, I don't know what would happen. But it would be better than when I was in high school or something.
Yeah.
But the other part about it is, it just gives you better physical abilities. So, like, I like going out dancing a lot and stuff, and you just have way better balance and
coordination.
Especially from doing Tai Chi, you learn slow muscle strength and coordination. So, most people, if you start out and you just have your hand here, right, and you're going to move it really slowly, most people, their hand will like shake because they don't know how to move slowly. In fact, mine is not that good right now, but that kind of thing, your body can do it, right? and it's nice.
Yeah.
It feels good, right? And you're being in shape and you're getting skills, so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it seems like
I recommend it.
Yeah, and it seems like a good counterpoint to a lifestyle that is not very attuned to the state of your body, I think, in a lot of, like, it's like your consciousness of your physical form is just not important, and like when you're like, my consciousness is in this machine that's what's important. It's like shifting your focus of awareness of like what you are by doing this very physical thing seems like it's mentally valuable.
It's definitely healthy. It definitely, mentally valuable, I think, is actually an important point. And just associated with it, like the meditation practices that you pick up and stuff are, if you want to hold yourself together through a long indie development when you're getting no external validation or whatever, that stuff really helps a lot. Like, people just don't even understand how much it helps. I don't know if I would have finished Braid if I wasn't doing Kung Fu, even though you would think that it would hurt because I was spending all this time not working on the game. Probably helped.
Well, because it's like you're not going to spend every hour of your available hours working on the thing anyway. And even if you are, you're wasting a lot of that. So like being able to have a thing that you have to spend some of those hours that wouldn't be devoted to it productively anyway, like doing something that's good for you seems like a really valuable thing.
Totally.
So Braid came out, and then you started working on The Witness not too long at all after that.
Yeah. So I was doing these work parties with Chris, and then after a while, it became clear to me, like, oh wow, this is going to be a really big and ambitious game, and I shouldn't do it because it's going to take forever. And what we have now is even bigger by far than what I thought. But even what I thought it was going to be just seemed too big. But I was still in that mental model. I was assuming that I was going to do it like Braid, where like I was the only programmer, and I was going to design it and do all these things. But then after Braid continued to be financially successful, I realized like, oh, I have enough money, I can hire people, and we can make this a thing. So, before I realized that, I spent about 6 months on other prototypes and stuff. But after the end of that, or in October 2009, I said, okay, let's start a company, right, for real, and I started hiring people and all that good stuff.
And I assume that was... So here's something that I've thought about, something that struck me that I noticed, and, it's just strange. When you are doing a project that has some amount of scale, but also very few people working on it, is you end up having to do and think about so many different kinds of things on any given day. Because like even when we were just talking about, your inspirations for Braid from like Einstein's dreams, and having to like understand and think interestingly about physics conceptually and how that would work as an interactive thing, like then you have to go and like program a platformer, and understand what you need to do for Xbox and tell press about it. And because like I was working on Gone Home, at some point I realized like, what am I doing today? I bothered a record label about licensing a song. I rewrote audio diaries. I laid out some of the level and like lit it, and tomorrow I'm gonna go like do voice direction of like an act. And it's just like, what the fuck? Like, having to have like all of that practical info in your head of like, oh, I got a bug report because my scripting is broken when the player crouches in this one location, and I'm thinking about how to express who this character is through writing, and like, have you found, I assume you've had moments of that where it's like just having to think about it and do all the aspects of it is like, I don't know. Crazy? I don't know.
It's a little bit crazy sometimes. There are parts of that I like, though, and parts of it that I don't like, right? So the parts, I don't really want to grow this company much, but, if The Witness is financially successful enough that it makes sense to keep the company going, right? Which is probably a higher threshold for me than for a lot of people, but,
it's a higher threshold for this project than the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll explain that because it's relevant to what we're saying, actually, which is I'm not here to run a game company, right? I'm here to make specific games. So I don't want to end up in one of those situations that we've often seen happen, where you'll have kind of like a subsistence game company where they're kind of making it from year to year, just barely, and they're pitching projects like trying to get money or whatever. Like that, I think, is a tremendously bad environment in which to try to make games. So if it came to that, I'd probably go back to doing games as an individual again, and then maybe, look for people to help separately. I hope it doesn't come to that, right? Because it's really difficult to find talented people to help you make a game, and once you've got that, it's a shame to lose it, right?
Yeah.
But so the things that I don't particularly like doing are things like, I need to make sure that everyone has health insurance and that bill is getting paid.
Right.
Or I need to, just even scheduling meetings that I need to be in, like I don't know, I don't like that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm totally fine with talking to the press about the game. I'm totally fine with designing. I'm totally fine with high-level art direction even and stuff like that. But at some point, I'm doing a little too much. So all the businessy things I would like to offload, like business and office management.
Yeah.
Like I'd hire someone if I can find someone who's good at that. But all the other stuff I really enjoy doing. And before we started up the recording, you mentioned it as being like weirdly multidisciplinary, I think was the phrase. And it's like, yes, that's true. Especially it's kind of clearly true when you look at things like voice acting versus like fixing the scripting, sort of. But at the same time, like those traditional roles, they are arbitrary constructs to begin with, right? Like even the idea that you can have a designer who designs a game without programming, whatever video games are in 50 or 100 years, that might not even be a thing. Like maybe all designers are programmers. Maybe they're not like as serious of programmers as someone else, but it's already starting to happen. Like, I was just visiting a professor who teaches a game design school, who teaches at a game design school in New York. He teaches at NYU, and one of the first things he said was like, yeah, I don't believe you should call yourself a designer if you can't program, right? Now that's a relatively strong statement that a lot of people would disagree with, but that sentiment is out there, right? And that's already a combination of things that you would consider different disciplines. And there's all sorts of, if that doesn't make sense to anyone listening to this, there's all sorts of justifications behind that, like, a designer needs to design an inherently procedural system most of the time. If you're making like an adventure game that's all if statements, it's not the same, but most games, there's like a system producing things that happen, and you need to at least be able to think about that system in a systemic way.
Right.
And if you can do that, actually you can program even if you don't realize it, even if you don't know a programming language.
To be able to translate that into what happens on
the screen, because you'll end up writing notes like that anyway. You'll be like, oh, when the enemy is in his just hit state, then if you do something else at that time, then this happens, right? That's a program.
Right. It's
just in English.
Yeah.
So and then there's other things too, though, like, okay, when I'm designing, so direction of voice acting, which I'm going to be doing a little later. We've done temp voice for this game. We haven't done final voice. Mm-hmm. It's not like you can voice direct in a vacuum, right? Like there's an integrity of the whole work that has to be held, right? Yeah. And the more of an art game or the more of a personal game it is, the more important it is to hold that integrity, right? So when you make voice direction a separate job, then you make extra work of interfacing with that and making sure the integrity is held, and maybe you can't even ever get quite as close, right?
Yeah.
So in principle, and then that raises an interesting question, like suppose there was someone who was an amazing voice director, right? Much better than you knew you could be, right? Because you have no experience at that, or little. I guess you probably had some from...
I voice directed for BioShock DLC and stuff, but
imagine there was someone who did it for 10 or 15 years.
And right? when you meet someone like that, they have lot of learned skill, like a craft that it's not something you just are born with. Yes.
But when you talk to that person about what you're trying to do on a feeling kind of a level, you don't ever quite connect with them, and they don't quite get it. They get it a little bit, but not as far, right?
It's at least a like generation problem, like a copy of a copy kind of. Like it's an interpretation of your signal, right?
In that kind of a case, it's probably better for you to do it, I think.
The thing that I found, and I know you're using this as an example. The practical thing I found is having you be the one who's doing it, but having that very experienced, like technically competent, or I should say, skilled, talented voice director there to like help you. I think that
is very valuable.
Because whenever I've done voice direction stuff, I've always been like the one on the mic talking to the talent and saying like, in this scene, I need more emphasis on this, whatever. But then having the person who's spent so much time in studios with actors be able to be there, and in some cases you just don't have the words to express the thing you're clearly trying to, and they can help interpret is like super, super valuable.
I'm sure there's a great deal of skill. There's a great deal of skill involved in getting the performance you want, right? Yeah. Anyway, so I have an analogy to that actually happened with me. So on Braid, when I was doing, the programmer art version of the game and all that, the sound effects were downloaded from a website. It was like $1 a sound or something, right? And so in the same way that I tried to get, visual arts people to work with me, it took a great deal of effort to find people eventually.
Yeah.
I also was trying to find audio people to work with. And I went through a couple of rounds of trying to work with audio people, and they would always make this stuff, and I would listen to it, and it sounded like generic casual game sound effects in terms of the feeling, right?
Yeah.
In terms of, production skills, they were fine. They were better than the sound effects I had in there, but they were like missing the soul of the game, and they worked against the soul of the game, right? And so in the final shipping game, most of the sound effects, or the majority of them at least, are the dollar sound effects that I picked off the website, like with some processing that a professional sound guy did. And then he made some additional sounds for some other things. But a lot of them are just these sounds. Because when I went off the website and picked from these cheap-ass bad sounds, I was at least picking according to that criterion that's hard to express about what fits with the soul of the game.
Yeah.
And I ultimately came to that decision of, okay, we're going to use these sounds and not these other sounds, even though they're ostensibly poorer, right?
But they fit better. They express the thing better, yeah.
They prevent the game from being jarring in a certain way. And I don't know. It's hard to say if players would even think that, but I thought it. I couldn't listen to those sounds,
Yeah. I mean, something that I think is also true about having to do a lot of the implementation yourself, basically, or having to manage a lot of the production of the stuff yourself, and not just being able to say, I have this idea, will someone else please do it for me, is that it keeps you honest, right? Like, because myself being like the writer and level designer and like placing stuff in the level and having to actually script anything that was going to be scripted and so forth, it's like you then, any like creative decision you make is through the lens of, I'm going to have to do that, you know? And I think that leads to something that in a lot of ways will be more efficiently produced and a better expression of what you want to do than saying like, here's what I want to do. Hey, guy that works for me, please go do that. And if you tell me there's some problems with it, maybe I'll say, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll change the idea, or maybe I'll say, fight through the pain and figure it out. But like, when you have to know how that idea is going to be input into the machine, you know what it means to be making that
is totally true. Like, I've worked with designers in some of those past jobs that weren't that way. They just wrote the spec and said, do this, and it's a totally different experience, right? But there's other ways in which I think the creativity part gets better in this kind of scenario where you're doing a lot. So first of all, when you have the idea part of the idea, there's always the broad stroke, and then there's like the subtle strokes of it, right? And the subtle strokes of what you start with when you're aware of all the things that have to happen, will be aligned with those other things more likely, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if you start out with something that's kind of pointing the wrong direction, you have to have this process where you work with people to even discover that in the first place, because the programmer doesn't totally understand the idea, and you don't totally understand the programming, and then you go do all that, and it's like, oh, this doesn't totally fit, let's go revise it, or whatever. And you have to go through maybe 3 or 4 iterations to get to where you would have been on the first iteration when you just do it, right?
Yeah.
But then the other thing that I also have very direct experience with is even having the ideas in the first place, when you are doing a lot of different roles, you will have ideas that you just wouldn't have had without that perspective. So on Braid, I was on vacation, I was programming Rewind, and then I started thinking, so at first, like I said, the game wasn't going to be about Rewind. Rewind was like maybe one of the worlds, right?
Yeah.
And then I was like, I just programmed this thing that does Rewind, and the way it works is if you're holding down the key, then every frame, go over every object in the world and look up what its state was in the recorded state buffer, and then copy it over and, move the object, right? And that's Rewind. Well, here I'm iterating over every object in the world. What if it wasn't every object in the world, right? It was because I typed that code that I had that idea, right?
Yeah. And the thing that you're pointing at is that there were puzzles that were based around, like, the position of the key does not get rewound or whatever. Right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm more speaking about the basic premise of each world, though, right? So, World 2 is just Rewind in Braid. World 3 is there's Rewind, but green glowy objects are not affected by Rewind, and that's where that idea came from. And then World 4 is there's Rewind, but it's tied to your position, right?
Yeah.
And when you wrote the code, you see what can naturally happen to it, and those ideas may not have come if I hadn't been the programmer, right?
Definitely.
Or they may have come out a lot differently.
Yeah, come from a different place, or it may have been a much more roundabout way to arrive there. But I think absolutely. Like there are tons of little things I can think about when I've worked on various projects where, like, being inside of how the game works gives you a perspective on what you might be able to do that the player will actually see. That you only have the idea because, like, you're like, in the case of something like what I've worked on, it's like, oh, we have, when you mouse over something, there's text that says what you can do, and I can change that on the fly. So maybe if in this particular case you read this thing and you're reading it and the character's reading it, and then she stops reading this note and closes it, so reads a script action to close the note, and then we explain to the player what just happened, because now the frog text is different, because now it's moused over and it's like she's saying she doesn't want to read that, and it's like this thing that I would not have had that idea if it wasn't like every little piece of that was something I had to use practically in other situations.
And in that case, the way you're explaining it, it's kind of evident that the idea is not exactly separate from the interface, right? It's not like an abstract idea about something to do in a game, and then let's figure out how to do it in Gone Home. It's like, well, here's how you move through the world, and here's what you see, and we can do this with that, right? Yeah. And that's actually just dialing back to, like, the early days of being like a naive designer, and just like everybody thinks that they want to be a game designer, right? And everybody's got ideas for a game, and all the ideas are high concept-y and not connected to those concrete things, right? They're always like, well, what if there was a game where you were a dog living on Mars and you jumped over pits in the lower gravity and it was awesome, like. And that's, whatever. Yeah. Obviously, that's not a real idea that anyone's had, but they're like that. And because they don't have that grounding in reality, they're usually not that good in the sense that they don't lead to a good game when you type them in. Because being good involves being really acutely aware of all those, of what is really happening, right? What is really happening in a game isn't the fiction exactly, it's the, like, here's a note, and by the way, if you flip it over, you see the other side, right? Yeah. That's part of the interface, and but most notes don't have another side, so it's surprising or interesting when you do, right?
Yeah, right.
That kind of thing is where the magic moments of game design happen, and you don't get that without being concrete, I think. Yeah, which is different. I mean, you can be concrete when you've got a very divided set of roles that everyone's doing, but I think it happens less. And especially tricky magical things like that happen a lot less, right? In heavily segmented teams.
Yeah.
Because you just have to, even doing a little thing like that, right? That's one of the memorable moments of the game. It probably wasn't that hard to do unless you had some crazy bug messing it up, Yeah,
it used entirely existing functionality, except I never had a reason to need to force a note to close. So
yes.
I asked him and can you give me a script action that I can close the note as the designer? And he did it in 20 minutes.
Yeah, there you go. That would have taken meetings at Electronic Arts, right, to discuss the possibility, and it just everything becomes heavier weight.
Yeah.
So something that strikes me is that I know more about The Witness than I think people in the public do.
Well, you saw that little thing that I showed.
Stuff. Yeah, but that said, maybe in ways that are not super clear about the game yet, I feel like a lot of what The Witness is about, a lot of what you were inspired by or wanted to accomplish, were those kind of mechanical interactive eureka moments that come out of a change in how you relate to the world with the interactions you've seen and so on and so forth, but not in a eureka puzzle solving way like Braid was a lot of times. You're like, I figured out how to solve that puzzle, but more like that those very small moments of changing your perspective on how you can interact with the world or what it means. Or
I think that's true. But what's going on in The Witness, I think of it as a continuation of what happened in Braid, but
because you do have some puzzles, but there's more of this world exploration and other aspects of being in this space and relating to it.
Yeah. So what happens in The Witness though? So in Braid, there's a small number by small number, 70 puzzles in the whole game, right? And they're very discrete, and some of them are easy because they're introductory or whatever, but a lot of them are really hard. And that's the meat of the game, is having a really hard challenge, right? So for The Witness, there's a lot more puzzles.
There's discrete puzzles inside of the world. You've shown the line drawing puzzles.
Yeah. So counting all of the things that I would consider puzzles, which I'm not even going to elaborate what that means, there's probably 550 right now. So that's a different order of magnitude, first of all.
It's a good specific number to...
Yeah.
Probably about 550.
It's actually it's probably 535.
Okay.
But, I'm rounding up.
All right.
So what that lets you do... Well, there's a lot... What the structure of the game generally lets me do with the design is have there be a lot more of a flow to the puzzles and have the puzzles be more bite-sized individually. So it's not 550 really hard puzzles that you strain to solve. There's some of those in there. 5 to 10% of them are really hard. Another 5 to 10% are moderately hard. A lot of them are actually not hard at all. Over half, certainly, you probably can do without thinking that hard. But they're interesting, right? So just in Braid, every puzzle has a unique point. Nothing is repeated. If one of the puzzles, the idea is, you have to do something tricky with this elevator,
right?
I'm thinking of
the one that's called Hunt, where it's that's...
Yeah. Well, and that one comes back... That one exists in the game twice. There's a reprise of it, but the reprise is different, right?
Because it uses different...
Yeah, and so each of those has a different idea. And so The Witness is like that too. And what I've found is that as long as you have that idea, the puzzle's interesting. Because people go, I get this, right?
Yeah.
It's like reading a book. Reading a sentence in a book isn't hard usually, but you got an idea from it, right?
Yeah.
So, and you just read, and as long as the story is interesting, you've had a good time, right?
Yeah.
So The Witness is at one level doing something more like that, right? And so then when you have these moments of epiphany, I was stumped on something, and then now I see what's going on, and now I can solve it. It's not just about the fact that there's a moment of epiphany, right? It's about what you realize. right? There's always a content to what you realize that doesn't repeat. But sometimes it's really subtle and you don't even know what it is. But you know there's something that you can like feel that there's something there. Like that really always comes through.
Yeah.
And that's in stark contrast to what happens in a lot of games. Like a lot of designers say, I want to make the player feel smart, or, I want to give people an aha moment. And that's fine. But I think it's the content of the aha moment that matters more than the fact of it.
Yeah.
Right? Because a generic aha moment is like every other generic one in every game. But if you can make content that's its own thing, then it's not like every other one in every other game.
I feel like something that is interesting about where we are even having this discussion, and I think how you generally are talking to people publicly about this game, about The Witness, is I feel like you haven't been able to say a lot of specifics about exactly what you're doing and what the player's going to encounter in the game. You've shown like beautiful looking environments and some specific puzzles, and talked about some higher level stuff, and I feel like that's been something that's been true of, like, for instance, the Stanley Parable that came out recently, and even like our game, all we talked about was like the premise of the story and nothing about what happened after you actually started finding out what was going on.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a thing that there's a little bit of like this class of games that's now coming about, where it's like it's hard to talk about before it's out for reasons that are different than in some games where that can also be true. So do you feel like have you felt some tension there, like about how much you can share with people about this thing?
Fortunately, it's mostly resolved by now, right? But as you've been saying, one of the jobs is the PR hat that you have to wear, right? And you have to make sure that people know that you have a game, right?
Right.
That they think it's interesting, and that they probably at least consider it something they would plausibly buy, right? If you can do those things, you're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
Early on, I didn't know how much of that was going to naturally happen, right? It's like, oh, here's this game where you walk up to LCD panels and trace on stuff, and it looked butt ugly. It was like programmer art again, and you couldn't show screenshots and get people interested in it, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, people were interested, but it was because I had a track record, like they liked the last game. That was the reason, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's not enough if you really want to do a good job of wearing the PR hat, right? If you just ride on your own coattails, that's lame, right?
Yeah. Well, especially, I mean, practically speaking, for The Witness, you need a bigger audience than you had before. So you have to reach out to people that maybe didn't play Braid or don't care that this game is by the guy who made Braid.
That is absolutely true.
Yeah.
So, the whole point of the game is that you feel alone on this island.
Yeah.
It's like Myst that way,
right.
Where you show up and you're walking around and there's nobody else there and you're trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah.
You run into some audio logs, BioShock style, and you play those, and there's at least one character, possibly two or three, talking at you from those.
Yeah.
It's in that very traditional at this point format. And that's most of what's going on.
Okay.
So there's no
monster chomping.
No monster chomping. That would be a really good monster closet. You've played the game for 17 hours and nothing happened, and all of a sudden something jumps out. Yeah.
The most valid version of a monster closet. A monster closet with purpose.
Yeah.
And drive behind it.
So you had asked
the difficulty of talking about the game without talking about a lot of it.
Yeah. So I knew going way back that I would have to say something, but I really don't want to spoil the game.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of things have changed since that original conception of how I would do PR. So first of all, I brought the game to PAX in 2010, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, it was 2010. It was unlabeled, right? Nobody knew it was my game, and people played it, and I got to see how people would react to the game. And
so you just kind of did you have a booth?
I was sharing the booth with Spy Party in Monaco.
Yeah. So you just kind of had a laptop and people could come check out this thing, and it just
right?
I think it was a desktop machine, but yeah.
But it was like a weird stealth.
It was kind of over in the corner.
Right.
It was hard even to get to because like crowds from Monaco were in the way.
Right.
You know. So even though the game was hard to get to, a number of people played it, and I got to see how people interact with the game. And then Steven Totilo realized that it was my game or something. I forget how he figured it out, but so then, you know, he filmed it and posted that on Kotaku, and I got to see what some of the initial reactions were. Right.
Yeah.
And you know, what we showed was the beginning where it's like, oh, you go and you do some of these panel puzzles on this island. It's like the most basic thing that you would see.
Yeah.
And of course, you know, a lot of the forum reactions were like, oh, why would anyone play a game where you trace lines in maze puzzles or something, right? But then, right, I realized, okay, you could have like thought this out, but you know, you're often wrong and whatever. But you see it. You see, okay, here's an initial presentation that just happened. I didn't plan it. Here's the reaction. Why would anyone want to trace maze puzzles? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. But let me just pick one or two that don't spoil the game too badly. And that'll sort of be like anytime that I do PR in the future, I'll make sure to cover that. So that question is answered. So I knew one of my missions, if I'm a good PR person, is to make sure that by the time this game is out, nobody's asking this question. People need to feel confident that the game is deep and interesting and isn't tracing some mazes that you would see in a magazine, right? So things like that happen over time, you know. So like in 2011, then I did a press tour where I rented hotel rooms in some different cities, and I'd come up or I'd sit the press down with the game, and I'd leave for 2 hours, or I'd leave for an hour and a half and just let them play.
Yeah.
Programmer art game, you know, but it was totally stable and it had the puzzles in and stuff, and so people could see on their own the progression. And because I'm not sitting there, first of all, I'm not demoing it, right? It's a hard game to demo. Like I've actually, since I've demoed it at E3 like this year, and people don't get it when you demo it, even though you explain it, because it has to work in your head for you to get it.
And by you demoing it, you mean you're driving there.
Like I'm driving and there's a theater of people behind me. Like that always is not as good as when people actually play it for themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So during this press tour, fortunately, people were actually playing it for themselves. I gave them an hour and a half slot with a game far from release, which is like unheard of, right? Like usually there's a handler and making sure you don't trigger the bugs and whatever.
Right.
If there's a hands-on at all, which there usually isn't that early. But then they also just, you know, felt good about being able to explore the game they wanted to, rather than having a tightly controlled thing. So I learned a lot from that, like where the conversations went, right? I wouldn't try to control the conversation or whatever, but I'd give them an hour and a half at the game, and then we'd talk for 30, 45 minutes. And I would pay attention to the questions they asked and what they understood about the game and what they didn't, right? And that helps you refine the things that you have to say. So, you know, when you roll around to this year, I know how to talk about the game. Like I've established a certain territory that I'm willing to spoil. Like there's a few select puzzles. I have sort of this sequence that I just did at the PlayStation release party with some press where it's like, and in that one again I had to drive because it was short time slots, which is sad. Actually people could play, but they won't get that far, right? But you know, I would start driving and I'd be like, okay, here's the beginning of the game, and then here's where it expands out to become more interesting, and there's 3 or 4 puzzles that we've spoiled, you know, in the press over the past couple of years, and I show those because usually people haven't seen those, and then I say, well, and the game keeps going past that, and by the way, there's like 25 hours of single player content, and you've seen 1, right?
Yeah,
and that's usually enough to at least convince the people that you're showing the game to that yes, there's something here, right?
Yeah,
but you also like. There's a great deal of stuff that I intentionally do not show and will not show because I want to keep those experiences for the players who encounter them for the first time.
Yeah. We had an interesting experience with doing early hands-on. So when we started working on Gone Home 6 months before IGF, and we were like, okay, we need something that IGF judges can just download on their machine and hit play and have a good experience with. So, basically it has to be a hands-on demo. So we used it for a hands-on press demo. We came down here to San Francisco and had a bunch of people come and play. And we did the same thing where it was like, we'll leave you in this room for I think we booked hour-long slots, and we just left you in the room for half an hour and just do whatever you want, and then we'll come get you and we can talk about it afterwards. And that's good, because much the same way, the only valuable thing about Gone Home is actually being the person who's interfacing with it. Like, watching it over somebody's shoulder, it looks... You don't understand how that's not boring.
No, but also too, when someone's watching you over your shoulder,
then they feel
works
pressure.
The play experience. Yeah,
exactly. And we still found that was kind of true in a way, because there were journalists who were trying to get through as much as possible in the time frame, so they had more to write about. But still, it's much better. You don't want to have them have the option of being like, well, what should I do next? It's like, well, figuring out what to do next, deciding what to do next is the game. So so yes, I think not having that presence in the room is really valuable for them actually being able to experience it in a real way. But the additionally interesting thing to me is, we sent that build to journalists, some of them to their homes, and we're just use this, preview using this demo build, and it's the first hour of the game, and spoilers, whatever. It includes content about Sam and Lonnie's relationship, and it ends when they first kiss, and there were journalists who asked, is there anything in this that you don't want us to talk about, specifics of the story and stuff? I'm like, I gave you guys, anything in there is fair game. You can talk about anything that you encountered, that's why we gave it to you. In a really interesting way, despite that, nothing about the story got out. Yeah. Even in reviews, reviewers didn't talk about it, and the most valuable, the one journalist specifically was said to me, I'm not going to write about any of the specifics of their relationship and how it progresses, because I found that to be really powerful to discover for myself, and I wouldn't want to be a player that didn't get to have that part of the experience. Long story short, I think that if you make something that is inherently compelling, and then you trust journalists to encounter it and be the stewards of it, they want people to have that good experience, and I think you don't have to be too precious about keeping them away from it in a heavy-handed way.
That'll be nice if that happens. I know. We'll see.
You have a lot more game too. That's something about Braid was probably, I don't know, you could. If you were good at it, you could finish it in 6-8 hours, maybe.
Less than that.
Yeah.
4.
I don't remember.
It's
been a while. And you were saying this thing, you're finding that there are dozens of hours of content.
Yeah. I thought, when I originally started it, I was like, okay, this is going to be a bigger game than Braid. I think a Braid is 4 hours, so this will be 8 to 12. And in fact, it's somewhere between 25 and 40.
Yeah, which is crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. It also makes me feel better about taking so damn long to make it. But it's fine, because there's so much in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of which, I have taken up a lot of your afternoon, and I really appreciate you sitting down to talk to me. And I'm sure, as everyone else, just can't wait to see more of The Witness when it's done in the wild, and get our hands on it ourselves. But thanks again.
Right on. Thanks for having me.